Winter Palace, Petrograd, Russia, 1915. Tatiana Romanov was busily sewing away, filling the sitting room with the clacking of her sewing machine. As the needle did its work, threading a new piece of fabric her sister had gifted her. The fabric was part of a new dress, which she was in the final stages of completing. The dress would be a dark shade of navy blue with black lace adorning the neck, sleeves, and collar. Her three sisters, Anastasia, Maria, and Olga, sat scattered around her on the large plush couch, either reading or knitting while staring into the fireplace. The sisters all had long brown hair, dark green eyes, and wore flowing white gowns. They often spent time together, enjoying each other's company. Anastasia was the youngest of the group, while Olga was the oldest. Rain beat down heavily on the windows of the sitting room, as the skies above were illuminated by lightning. This had forced the sisters to stay inside, as they normally enjoyed roaming the grounds of the palace. All four sisters were seated in one of the palace's sitting rooms. The sitting room was well furnished, with comfortable chairs, a bookshelf, table, and couch. The couch and chairs were arranged in front of the fireplace to keep them warm during the long Russian winter. Anastasia had gotten back very late the night before, after conducting business for their father. She hadn't given her sisters any details, nor had they asked, as they knew she wasn't allowed to tell them. Anastasia had gotten them all gifts while she had been out. This was a normal habit of hers, which she often did upon coming back from one of her assignments. A quiet knock upon the door of the sitting room caught the four sisters' attention. They all glanced towards it, wondering who had come to see them. "Yes? Who's there?" called Anastasia. She could already sense who the person was before he entered. She knew Rasputin had come to check her progress. The old priest would want to know how her assignment had gone. No doubt word of Enzo's death had been in the papers. The door opened quietly, confirming her suspicions. Rasputin wore the black robe of a priest and had a thick beard. He was pale and had intense, piercing eyes, which seemed to stare right into Anastasia's soul. Upon seeing him, the girls rose quickly to their feet, eager to meet him. "Rasputin, you're finally back," declared Tatiana, putting aside her sewing machine. Rasputin chuckled softly, stepping forward to embrace them. "Your father tells me you're doing very well in your studies. That's good to hear," he stated. "What brings you here? Did father need something from you?" inquired Maria. Rasputin nodded. "I came here to check on your brother and decided to see how the four of you were doing," he stated. "We're doing quite well, though we wish this terrible war would end," informed Olga. "Da, I have confidence in our forces. Soon we will defeat the Kaiser," replied Rasputin. "How long will you be here?" inquired Anastasia. Rasputin glanced over Olga's shoulder to look at her. "I'll be staying for dinner tonight," he replied. The four sisters became excited at this, giving each other eager looks. "Excellent news! Rasputin, you must come have a seat with us. I'm very close to finishing a new dress. I'd love you to see it," stated Tatiana. Rasputin shook his head. "Perhaps later. I have something I must discuss with Anastasia," he replied. "Oh, is it anything exciting?" inquired Maria. Rasputin shook his head. "Unfortunately, I can't say anything about our business. It concerns only your sister and father," he informed. Anastasia stood up from the couch, walking over to Rasputin. She glanced back at her sisters. "I'll be back. Rasputin and I have business to discuss," she informed. She and Rasputin left the room, leaving her sisters to continue their reading. Rasputin closed the door behind him as they stepped out into the corridor. The ground beneath their feet was covered by a thick burgundy carpet, one that covered the stone floor of the palace. "I heard about the accident at the theater last night. It seems Enzo Ricci had died of a heart attack. This was very fortunate for us, as he was aiding the Bolsheviks," informed Rasputin. He and Anastasia walked quickly down the wide palace corridor, bound for her father's study. It was chilly inside the palace as the cold from outside seeped in. That's good to hear. Perhaps the orchestra was more than he could handle. I found Rite of Spring to be rather jarring, though still enjoyable. I've heard the ballet based on the symphony is quite energetic, replied Anastasia. The stone walls of the Winter Palace were decorated with various portraits of Anastasia's long-dead ancestors, who she sometimes had dreams and visions of, seeing flashes of their lives, like snapshots in a book. They were on the second floor of the Winter Palace, the same floor where she and her sister slept. Rasputin led her to her father's office, which was up the hall from the sitting room where she and her sisters had been. Rasputin opened the door to her father's study with a creak, ushering her inside before closing the door behind her. Her father's study was a neat and tidy room, one that held a collection of files and papers housed in steel filing cabinets. The files contained records and sensitive information. The cabinets were locked with a key, one which her father alone possessed. Anastasia was sometimes allowed to read some of these files if they pertained to one of her assignments. Tsar Nicholas II looked up, seeing that his daughter had arrived to see him. He sat behind his desk, reading a collection of reports from the front lines. He put the reports aside, shoving them quickly into a drawer on his desk. He then beckoned her over. Anastasia, it's so nice to see you. I heard about the tragic accident at the Opera House. You did an excellent job. Come, I want to hear the details. How did Enzo react when you confronted him with the evidence of his treachery? He stated. Anastasia walked over to him, taking a seat in front of his desk. He didn't react well. He got angry, then tried to flee. I stopped him. He refused to tell me who gave him the money, even when I applied significant pressure. I ended his life when it became apparent that he wasn't useful, informed Anastasia. Tsar Nicholas nodded his head. Good. I knew you would not disappoint. It's fortunate that you could not force the truth from him, but he was too dangerous to be left alive, he replied. Anastasia nodded. Yes, I hope your bounty hunters managed to capture their targets. We need more information about the Bolsheviks. This banker was funding them before I stopped him. He won't be the last to act as a middleman for whoever is plotting against us, she added. Rasputin cleared his throat, gaining the Tsar's attention. Yes, speaking of bounty hunters, Lancelot Ricketts is on the way. He managed to escape those arms dealers in Volgograd, he informed. Excellent. Send them up to me the moment he arrives. I want a full report. Have the prisoners interrogated post-haste, the Tsar instructed. Rasputin nodded. Do you have any new assignments for me, father? Inquired Anastasia. Nicholas nodded. I do. The next targets will be more difficult to eliminate than the last, he replied. Nicholas reached down into his desk, taking out an envelope and sliding it over to Anastasia. She took it from him and opened it, revealing black and white photos of 4 gruff-looking men, ranging in age from their early 20s to mid-30s. Your targets are Sergei Uranov, Yosef Chernov, Vladimir Dmitri, and Yuri Nikolai. You'll have to kill all 4 of them and any of their guards who try to stop you. You'll find them most nights at the Vorkuta bar, he informed. Anastasia nodded. What did they do? She inquired. They're Bolshevik agitators who firebombed a printing press in Belarus. We also have reason to believe that they might know the identity of the banker funding the Bolsheviks, Nicholas replied. Anastasia nodded, rising from her chair and taking the document with her. When do I hunt them? She inquired, glancing over at her father. Tsar Nicholas folded his hands on his desk, looking at his daughter with approval. Tonight, Rasputin will drive you to the bar after your lessons, answered Nicholas. Good. I'm eager to begin my work, replied Anastasia. She and Rasputin exited her father's office, closing the door quietly behind them. 9:30 p.m., Petrograd, Russia. Anastasia stood outside the Vorkuta bar, looking up at the wooden sign outside its entrance. Inside, she could hear the laughter and conversations of drunken men, some of whom were singing revolutionary songs, confirming to her that she was in the right place. Having uncovered the nest of traitors, Rasputin had dropped her in a dingy alley behind the bar, allowing her to approach it unnoticed. She wore a dark gray dress, with a gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders, fastened into place by a silver brooch. Her face was covered by the gold tragedy mask which she had worn when meeting Enzo Ricci. She walked swiftly down the dirty alleyway, doing her best to avoid the spider webs which hung in her way. The alleyway was occupied by drunks and vagrants, who cast lustful looks upon her as she passed by them. The brick walls of the bar were covered by a layer of moss and grime, having never been cleaned properly. She rounded a corner, stepping out of the alley and onto the sidewalk. She now stood on the streets of Petrograd, just down the street from a group of beggars. Turning to her right, Anastasia approached the entrance of the Vorkuta bar. Already she could smell the savory scent of the stew brewing inside, which had been simmering away for countless hours. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the bar, causing them to slam against the wall with an ear-splitting clatter, one that could be heard out on the street. The patrons inside temporarily stopped their chatter. Lowering their mugs, they looked up to see who had arrived. Many of them were surprised to see a woman in their bar, at least one who was not there to sell her body. The frowning, golden tragedy mask she wore unnerved many of them, who were uncertain why she covered her face. They watched her with growing distrust, glaring at her. The first stranger they had seen all night. Anastasia walked slowly over to the bar, making her way towards a heavily built group of men who sat drinking from tall, frothy mugs, filled to the brim with cold beer. They had been drinking for some time before she arrived and were already heavily intoxicated. The men wore common-looking street clothes and were tall and broad-shouldered. There were 4 of them in total, all sitting together. The men glanced at each other, then back at the newcomer to their bar, wondering who she might be. One of them, a tall and burly man, sporting a hammer and sickle tattoo on his right arm, sat up, feeling uneasy. There was something about the masked woman which filled him with dread. He was not a man used to feeling fear. In fact, normally he was the cause of people's fears. He had beaten people before, men who owed money to loan sharks or crooked bankers. They always looked at him with fear as he stood above their broken bodies, their blood staining his shirt. Anastasia leaned against the grimy bar, looking over at the bartender. He was an old man who said very little most of the time. She took a handful of rubles from her pocket and laid them on the bar, sliding them over to him. "Excuse me, I'd like a glass of red wine," she requested. The bartender responded with a curt nod, reaching under the bar, where he retrieved a bottle of wine. "What brings you here? You're very different from my usual customers," noted the bartender. He regarded her with interest, watching his reflection in her golden mask. "I have business with some of your customers. I was informed they could be found here," she replied. The bartender poured her glass of wine, sliding it across the table to her. "Which of my customers are you here to see? For a small fee, I can tell you when you might find them here," he informed. Anastasia reached into her pocket, pulling out a collection of black and white photographs, which she held up for him to see. "These are the men I'm looking for. If you can inform me of their location, I'm willing to compensate you," she informed. The bartender took the photos from her and began to look through them. His eyes widened when he saw who they were, and he gave her a glance of alarm. "How do you know of these men?" he whispered, leaning in close to her. Anastasia shrugged. "My business is my own. Can you tell me where they are, or not?" she snapped, growing impatient. Anastasia felt a strong hand clasp her shoulder. "I think it's time for you to leave," growled a gruff voice behind. She turned on the bar stool, coming face to face with one of her targets, Yuri Nikolai. Yuri was less than pleased to see her there, not knowing why she was seeking him out, or how she had found out where he was. "Take your hand off me, now," replied Anastasia. Yuri ignored her demand, tightening his grip on her shoulder, digging his dirty nails into her flesh. "Tell me what you want with me," he demanded, fixing Anastasia with a menacing glare. "We can discuss business somewhere more secluded. Now, take your hands off me," replied Anastasia. Yuri shook his head. He then moved to grab her head, intent on yanking off the mask she wore. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold steel of her mask, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. His hand exploded into a bloody mess, his fingers twisting backwards all the way to his knuckles, breaking each one of them. His entire arm was then violently twisted, snapping with a violent crack. Yuri opened his mouth, letting out a blood-curdling scream. Blood gushed from his wound, spraying both the bar and Anastasia's golden mask. Yuri was then thrown violently backwards, smashing into the wall behind him. He hit the wall with such force that the back of his head split open, leaving a bloody imprint. The other patrons of the bar began to panic, leaping up from their seats. The bartender dashed out from behind the bar, attempting to make his way out the front door. He only managed to get within a few inches of the door before he was tossed through the air, landing a few feet away. He then slid across the floor, lifting into the air before slamming into the wall. He kicked and shouted, attempting to get himself down, to no avail. Anastasia stood up from her bar stool, walking over to the terrified bartender. She once again lifted up the photos she had shown him earlier. "I'm going to ask you again. Have you seen these men?" she inquired. The bartender nodded rapidly. He pointed towards the crowd at a group of 3 men who stood at the back of the bar. "Thank you for your cooperation," stated Anastasia. She dropped the bartender to the ground, leaving him behind as she approached the 3 men. They attempted to escape, making a mad dash for the rear exit, knocking over tables and chairs in their haste. Sergei Urinov managed to get his arm through the doorway, only to have it slam closed with a tremendous force, severing his arm at the elbow. The man fell to his knees, crying out in pain, as blood gushed from the open wound. The rest of the patrons, who were not the victims of Anastasia's attack, ran past her, escaping out the front door behind her. They burst out of the bar, screaming and shouting for help. The bartender, who was still covered in blood, ran across the street to the nearby general store to try and phone the police. While back inside the Vorkuta bar, Sergei Urinov looked up at his attacker, a young woman wearing a golden tragedy mask. Sergei felt himself begin to lose consciousness. "Who are you?" he moaned, clutching the stump where his arm used to be. Anastasia did not reply to him. She placed her foot on his chest, pushing him onto his back, where she left him to die. Yosef Chernov and Vladimir Dmitri stood behind Sergei, frantically beating on the door in an attempt to escape. Yosef turned to face her. "Who are you? And how are you doing this?" he shouted. Anastasia shook her head, looking into his eyes, saying nothing. Yosef took a step backwards, putting his back against the doorframe. He then drew a revolver, pulling back the hammer and aiming it at her head. His head trembled, making it hard to keep his sights of her. "Don't come any closer!" he shouted. Vladimir was still beating on the door, with his back to Anastasia, hoping that he could escape. Yosef inched his finger towards the trigger, aiming for the golden mask his attacker wore. Anastasia raised a hand, lifting him into the air. The revolver was torn violently from his grasp, landing on the ground several feet away. It hit the floor with enough force to cause it to discharge with a loud crack. Its bullet hit a bottle of cooking oil in the kitchen, causing it to explode and start a small fire, which spread quickly, engulfing the entire kitchen in flames. Smoke soon began to pour into the bar as the flames began to spread out of the kitchen. Anastasia held Yosef in the air, watching as he clawed at his throat, struggling to breathe. "Please," he gasped, staring down at Anastasia with wide eyes. She increased the pressure on his neck, cutting off his speech. Vladimir turned to face Anastasia, looking up to his friend hanging in midair. For a moment, Yosef looked down, silently begging for his help. Then his windpipe was shattered with a loud snap, causing him to go limp. Anastasia dropped his body to the ground with a thud, where it landed on a table, knocking it to the floor with a loud clatter, sending mugs of beer shattering onto the ground. Now Vladimir was alone with his attacker, the only member of the group left. The bar was openly burning behind Anastasia, the flames growing increasingly violent, threatening to burn down the whole bar. He advanced on her, shouting with anger, his fists raised to strike her. Vladimir was ready to kill her. His hands were inches from her throat when he was tossed over her shoulder, flipping head over heels and landing hard on his back, knocking the wind out of him. Vladimir lay on the ground, dazed. The roof above his head was smoking, and the flames behind him were closing in rapidly. Anastasia walked around him, her heels clicking loudly on the floor of the bar. Vladimir tried to speak, to shout words of hate at her, but all he could manage to do was cough, as smoke filled his lungs. He struggled to his feet, trying to ignore the pain in his back. Now all he could hear was the roaring of the flames. The billowing black smoke stung his eyes, blurring his vision. With a muffled groan, he stumbled towards the exit, desperate to escape. Anastasia blocked his path, standing in the doorway of the bar. Much to Vladimir's astonishment, she held the glass of wine she had ordered, having grabbed it from the bar moments before it ignited. She stood calmly by the exit, sipping from the glass, ignoring the flames which were rapidly consuming the bar around her. "Move! If we don't leave here now, we'll both die!" shouted Vladimir. Anastasia shook her head. "Niet, only you will die," she replied. For a moment, the two of them made eye contact. Vladimir took another shaky step towards her. He now stood by a window which looked out onto the street, where a small crowd had gathered. His hand slowly inched towards his pocket, reaching for a knife. A sound off to his left caught Vladimir's attention. He snapped his head in that direction, just in time to see a flaming table flying rapidly towards him. He had no time to move or attempt to save himself, only managing to get out a single gasp before the table slammed violently into him, hitting him with enough force to send him flying out the window. Vladimir hit the ground hard, landing on his side. He let out a pained cry as the pavement impacted his already broken ribs, sending waves of pain shouting through his body. A crowd of people who had been standing outside, watching the flames, scattered when they saw the table come smashing through the front windows of the Vorkuta bar. Glass and wood splinters covered the sidewalk, and Vladimir lay in a bloody puddle. Anastasia stepped out of the bar, walking over to where Vladimir lay, panting and moaning on the ground. Vladimir coughed up blood, trying weakly to flee from her. "Oh, why?" he gasped. Anastasia lifted him into the air while the terrified onlookers screamed. Vladimir screamed for help, waving his hands around violently, hoping that someone would intervene. Unfortunately for him, no one did. Instead, they chose to watch from a distance, wondering just what was going on. For a moment, Anastasia held him in midair. Then she tossed him backwards, impaling him on a lamppost. The crowd began to scream, fleeing the scene en masse, rushing to get away from the woman in the gold mask. Anastasia sat her empty glass of wine down in front of the burning bar, then walked back into the alley where Rasputin had dropped her off, disappearing into the night moments before the police and military arrived on the scene, responding to frantic reports of an attack and fire at the Vorkuta bar. And a big thanks to my patrons, Miriam, Dan, Jacob, Teddy Dog, Shoji, Katie, Patricia, and the Reptile. Thanks so much for making the decision to support my channel.